He is the bread of life, the way, the truth, and the life. He is the true vine, the light of the world, the good shepherd, and the door. He is the resurrection and the life. He is I am.
Well, good morning, NorthPoint Church. My name is Jay Quick, and I'm the Student Ministries Director, and I work with the young adults in this church, for those of you who don't know me. And it has been said about me that I can be competitive from time to time. I enjoy to compete in whatever it may be, whether it's card games or playing pickup basketball or whatever it is. I love to compete. I love to be able to watch competition as well, whether it's a sports thing, whatever's going on. I love to be able to see people compete to win. But I also like to see people not just compete against each other, but also on the same team competing against each other once in a while. And when I think about this, I think of the great Tim Duncan and David Robinson. If you remember back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, just seemed like this dynasty went on forever. 1987, not Tim Duncan, that was later. David Robinson was drafted first overall pick in the 1987 draft, and he had a great career. 1987 for the next few years, the next decade or so, fantastic player. 1992 comes the dream team, the greatest team to ever walk the face of the earth, Michael Jordan, and you have Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and the legends of the NBA with David Robinson anchoring them at center. He was a part of this team. You also get then all of a sudden in 1997, the first overall draft pick, Tim Duncan. So you got 7'1", David Robinson, 6'11", Tim Duncan. These guys are tearing it up in the NBA. They go on to win an NBA championship in 1999. Tim Duncan wins the MVP, and all of a sudden there's discussion. Well, who's going to be greater? Is it going to be David Robinson, or is it going to be Tim Duncan? Who's better? And Tim Duncan wouldn't be as good if you didn't have David Robinson, and all of a sudden the debate went on and on and on, and Tim Duncan ended up going on after David Robinson retired and had a successful career and got a few more rings of his own in the Spurs dynasty. Another one that's competitive that I like to look at, but it's a little bit more personal, as they were competing for one position, was Steve Young and Joe Montana. Back in the 80s and the early 90s, Joe Montana, the Hall of Fame quarterback, takes the reign, wins some Super Bowls, excellent quarterback. And all of a sudden, this guy named Steve Young comes on the scene. And Steve Young was also the quarterback competing for the exact same spot. And as they're competing in the late 80s, all of a sudden, Steve Young gets some time, and they see him in the game as Joe Montana's been injured, and they're going, well, this Steve Young guy, he's pretty good. Like, he's really good. Is he going to take us to higher heights than Joe Montana? And they begin to split time. And then all of a sudden, the rumors and the fans and the players say, well, I'm on team Joe Montana. Well, I'm on team Steve Young. And they have this controversy on the same team competing for the same exact position. All of a sudden, in the early 90s, they trade Joe Montana, the Hall of Fame quarterback, to the Kansas City Chiefs. Steve Young takes over and goes on to win a Super Bowl. And this is a competition amongst each other, even though they were going for the same thing, the same position, the same goal to win an NFL championship, the Super Bowl for their team. This is a little bit like what we see in John chapter 3 at the end of the chapter. Two people competing for the same thing, and people going, well, hey, wait a second, what about that guy? And here we see John Baptist. If you have your Bibles, open to John chapter 3 at the end of the chapter. We see John the Baptist have one of his followers kind of come up to him. And in this scenario, verses 22 through 25, it kind of is building what's happening. There's some baptisms being taken place, and Jesus and his disciples are baptizing people, and they're having this discussion on ceremonial cleansing and purification. And all of a sudden, that discussion just totally stops. Like, that's the end of it in verse 25. And we pick up in verse 26, where they come to Jesus with a question, come to John the Baptist with a question. They ask John the Baptist this. They say, they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan, the one you testify about, look, he is baptizing and everyone is going to him. So just a little bit of context here. What's going on at this point in the story is that John the Baptist has some followers. They're getting a little bit jealous. They're kind of going, hey, like, I was with you from the very beginning, John. Like, when you were nothing, when you were here in the wilderness, I was with you as an early follower. And they're saying, John the Baptist, you're kind of a big deal. You're actually the one who broke the 400-year silence from God to his people. God had not spoken directly to his people in over 400 years. He had been sending previous to that messengers and prophets and leaders to lead his people. And for 400 years, God is silent. Then all of a sudden, this guy, John the Baptist, this kind of hippie dude, which we've learned about already in the series, but this guy who wears camel hair as clothing, he eats honey and locusts, and he's in the wilderness all by himself, just an odd dude. And all of a sudden, he gets this huge following from every social status and class. People are coming to see John the Baptist, and his stock is rising like crazy. And all of a sudden, it's looking like John the Baptist is about to go bankrupt because they come to him and go, hey, wait a second. Everybody is going over to follow this guy. And they don't even say Jesus' name. They don't want to give Jesus too much credit because they're invested in their teacher and their leader, John the Baptist, going, hey, what's the deal? Is that guy's baptism better than yours, John? Like what's going on? Why are all the followers, everyone is going over to Jesus? And we see, humanly speaking, John the Baptist has every right to say, you know what? Like, that's right. Like I foretold about this Jesus guy. Like I'm the messenger. Like I'm the great one. I deserve a following. Yet John the Baptist doesn't respond that way. Verse 27, he says this, to this John replied, a person can only receive what is given to them from heaven. John the Baptist responds to this very humbly, and what he does here is embrace a humble belief. And the humble belief that John the Baptist embraces is that God is the sovereign gift giver. He recognized that a man can only inherit what's been given to him from heaven. And he's saying, hey, look, that's not my role. God chose Jesus for such a time as this and this place for these followers to establish the church. This is what's going on. God chose me to pave the way. I foretold of this. I helped prep this. This is my role, and I'm going to stay in my lane. And even though these people are wanting him to go over and to take the followers back away from Jesus and to go to their crowd and say, hey, we want this big following again, it's not what John the Baptist does. He embraces the humble belief in the fact that God is the sovereign gift giver. A very simple theological belief that we can inherit as well. Because when we do that, it begins to change things. About that job that you've been working really hard at to earn that job promotion, you didn't really earn that. That's a gift from God. And you may think that, man, I'm really gifted and talented in my 9th grade basketball team and I earned a spot on the A team, or I've made it the band or the choir or the academic all team, whatever the case is. You're thinking, man, I'm a pretty smart guy. I'm a good athlete. I'm a good this or that. And the reality of it is the good Father, the sovereign God that we have has given you a gift for you. And you might think, certainly you've worked hard for that and you've studied and you've prepped and you've planned, but God is the sovereign gift giver of all gifts and all good things. And if we aren't careful to embrace this belief on our own, we fall into the trap of pride. Pride begins to well up in our own lives and we think, you know what, I'm pretty good. I'm actually better than those guys because I made the A team, or I got the job promotion, or I'm this kind of awesome guy, which John the Baptist, which we said, humanly speaking, he had every right to go, hey, like this guy broke the silence of God Almighty of 400 years. Like I'm a big deal. And I predicted that guy, Jesus. So follow me. But he doesn't do that. He embraces a humble belief that God is the sovereign gift giver. And if we don't do that as well, we fall into the pride trap. But it's not just the pride trap that we also have to watch out for. It's also the trap of jealousy. Because if we don't embrace the fact that God is the sovereign gift giver, that he gives gifts to other people as well, we soon to look at that person who had just got his promotion. We go, well, that should have been me. I worked harder than that person. I earned this. I'm better at this, or whatever the case. And we go down all these scenarios and we think of me. And all of a sudden we become jealous of what God has gifted to other people, where John the Baptist says, no, that's not the case. A man can only receive what's been given to him from above. God is the giver of good gifts to us, but he's not just the giver of good gifts. We have to press a little bit further. Sometimes God gives trials and sorrows and hardship as well. And for some of you, man, 2020 and even 2021 has been an incredibly difficult year. And for that, I just want to say, man, I'm sorry, but admits that God is still sovereign. And he is on his throne. And if we don't embrace the role of God's sovereignty as the humble, good gift giver, as well as trials and sorrows, a little bit of a seed of bitterness begins to well up in our hearts. And that may be just a small season, but for some of you, you maybe have been holding on to bitterness in your life for a number of years, and it's grown and it's overtaken you, and it's gonna lead to your death. When we focus inwardly on ourselves and we don't include the fact that God is a sovereign gift giver, including sometimes trials and sorrows, we lose sight of his sovereignty and goodness, and we fall into the trap of pride or jealousy or bitterness. We see a little bit further along in the story in verses 28 and 29, John the Baptist not just embraces a humble belief, but he pursues a humble attitude. 28 and 29, he says this, "You yourselves can testify that I am not the Messiah, but I am the one that was sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete." So what we hear here in this text here is that John pursues a humble attitude, and he knows his role. He says, I'm a friend of the groom. I'm not the groom. I don't receive the bride. That's Jesus' role. I'm just a friend of the groom, which is an equivalent of what he's saying here is he was the best man in his culture. I don't know about you guys today, but the best man kind of has a fun role today where they goof around a little bit. They support the bride and groom, but they joke a bit. At my own wedding, we were married outside in an apple orchard, and it's time to collect the rings, which is like the most important role of the best man. And all of a sudden, my brother pulls an apple out from his pocket. He's like, "Oh, is this the ring?" Like, "Oh, I'm funny, you know?" Like, dude, you're a doofus. Like, give me the rings. Like, he's just embracing this role of kind of goofing around and playing nicely and whatever the case. But man, that's not the role of a friend of the groom in the Eastern culture. They don't just kind of show up with half mismatched socks and that and show up the day of the wedding and have some fun and be lighthearted. They put in work. And so as the bride had to receive a dowry, her family had to be paid off for what their family was losing. They would receive a gift from the father and the mother of the groom to say, hey, since you're losing this family member and here's what she would have given you to your family, we're gonna give you livestock, we're gonna give you money, we're gonna pay for that. And right alongside the father and the mother was what was called the shashbin, the friend of the groom. He embraced this role to help the contract, the negotiations come along smoothly. And it wasn't just prior to the wedding, it was at the wedding ceremony also. He presided over the wedding to make sure everything was flowing smoothly, that the foods, the drinks, that everyone was having a good time at the wedding. But it didn't just stop at the wedding. In Eastern culture, for the wedding to become official, the bride and the groom would have to consummate their marriage to become one. And so in the bridal room, the bride would go wait for her groom expectantly as she would prepare to meet her groom. There was one person who stood outside those doors. It was the shashbin, the friend of the groom, and his role was to protect it. There was nobody getting in that bridal room except for the groom. And so when we see here in verse 29, when he says he waits and listens for the groom's voice, this is exactly what he's talking about. When he heard the groom's voice in the dark of the night coming to the bridal room, he knew that his joy and his role was complete because the groom was coming and he can open up that door to become one with his bride. And that's exactly what's happening with the church. The church, the followers of John the Baptist are leaving, they're being established, they're becoming one in this time as Jesus' ministry has now become. And Jesus' followers are gaining, and he's establishing himself as the groom and the church as the bride. Now think of it in today's terms. You go to a wedding today, the most beautiful, epic part of it is obviously when the doors open in the back and the most beautiful woman in the room walks down the aisle and the music begins to hit that pinnacle and all of a sudden all the eyes that are fixated on the groom begin to slowly look up, or the bride, and they slowly look up to the groom, and as they see the groom's delight just overtaking him, and they look back to the bride, and she's full of joy. And as soon as they're getting ready to meet and embrace and hold hands and to begin the wedding ceremony, imagine just for a second, John the Baptist, as his role as the best man, goes, hey, everybody, thanks for coming to celebrate this guy. Like, I'm the messenger. I told you about Jesus was coming. I broke the silence of 400 years. I'm kind of a big deal. Like, hey, look at my song and dance. Like, I'm the guy you came to see, right? It'd be ridiculous. Like nobody in their right mind would ever do that. And this is what John is saying. Why are you trying to get me to go to attract the followers of Jesus back to me? They're not meant for me. My role is a friend of the groom, and I have fulfilled that role because now the bride, the church of Christ, the followers in Jesus, they're meeting and they are becoming one He's pursued a humble attitude to know his role as a shashbin, and he has self-awareness to be able to know that. And his joy is made complete when he thinks beyond himself, beyond the fact that he's losing followers. His joy is found in the fact that Christ is gaining followers, and Christ is growing, and Christ is increasing. And that's where his joy is found. And that makes sense, because if you think about it, even in our culture today, in our day and age, there's a lady named Jean Twenge, and she wrote a book called Generation Me. And she began to study back in the 1940s and 50s, some of the literature that was written over all those 50 years leading up to the 1990s or so. And what she found was that the amount of talk about self-esteem had over doubled. Like there was this movement within our culture to say, just have positive self-esteem, like just be able to believe in yourself. And she studied these terms of love yourself, believe in yourself, stand up for yourself, believe you can do it. Just give yourself a positive pep talk, which sometimes is needed for sure. But in her studies, what she had found is that those who had put their soul worth in trying to have a better self-esteem actually led to themselves having a less self-esteem. Because when you look inwardly, we can't find joy in and of ourselves. We find it in Christ. And the second thing of her study is they became more and more self-absorbed and narcissistic than any other generation to ever before, because they were looking to themselves, and instead of leading to joy to focus on themselves, it led to depression and anxiety and a lack of joy. And certainly there's a biology that leads to depression and anxiety and those things as well. But some of it is the fact that we've turned inward to look at ourselves for our own satisfaction, and we've taken our eyes off of the groom and we've taken them upon ourselves. So what does this look like for you and I as we embrace a humble belief and we pursue a humble attitude, and as we desire to live a humble life? We see in verse 30 that John gets to kind of the pinnacle of this passage where he says, he, as in Jesus, he must increase and I must decrease. And his joy is in the fact that he's decreasing. His following is decreasing and Jesus is increasing. And so what does that look like for you and I? Does that mean that we try to avoid the spotlight? Does that mean that we try to not be bold and stand up for what we believe in? What does it look like to be humble in today's day and age? The Bible actually declares Moses as the most humble man on the face of the earth. And you take a look at Moses, and he certainly didn't avoid the spotlight. Like he was front and center in one of the greatest movements of all time as he led the Israelites out of captivity from the Egyptians. And he stood before Pharaoh, the most powerful person in that realm, and he said, "Let my people go," with boldness, not because of him, but because of God the Father. And yet he was called the most humble man on the face of the earth. So it's not a lack of boldness. It's not a lack of being in the spotlight. Another guy by the name of F.B. Meyer was a pastor in England at the time, the 1800s and early 1900s, and he pastored at a time where there was another great pastor just down the street by the name of Charles Spurgeon. Many of you know Charles Spurgeon, a great teacher and philosopher, and Charles Spurgeon had a great influence on Christianity in Europe and all over the world. And as he was faithfully preaching each and every week, he would watch many people walk by the front doors of his church right past to go on down to see Charles Spurgeon preach. And he struggled with that for a little while to go, why doesn't God increase my role? Why doesn't God give me more people to follow? Fast forward a few years, he had gotten the invitation to speak with D.L. Moody and to be able to preach, and an opportunity to preach and partner with him. And while he had done that, there was another guy by the name of Morgan Campbell who was just kind of starting out his career as a pastor and a preacher. And he was able to preach next to him, and just a few people came to see F.B. Meyer. Just a few people came, and they were encouraging, and they said, good message. But man, as soon as Morgan Campbell, though he was less polished, less gifted, and less influential, they flocked to see this guy. I mean, people out the doors were coming in, just filling up the church to see him. And later that day, he had kind of gone a little bit sadly and prayed before God and pressed in. And after he had walked out of his cabin to interact with people, they heard him saying, "My goodness, did you hear Morgan Campbell preach today? God is upon that man. May he increase and may I decrease." It wasn't about him being in the spotlight. It wasn't about that. It was about him being faithful to his role. It was as if he embraced the belief before C.S. Lewis had even quoted it, his famous quote on humility. He said, humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's not talking down your giftings. It's not thinking you're a bad person. It's thinking less of it's thinking of yourself less. And so for you and I, what does that mean for us? I'll tell you what it means for me. It's something I struggle with every single day, to think of myself less. Because oftentimes my routine is I'll go to work, Sometimes it'll be a difficult day or a hard day. You have hard conversations, you're studying, you feel kind of fried. Getting home, you're like, you know what? I've worked hard this week. Like, I deserve a little couch time. Like, March Madness is coming up and my Hawkeyes have been playing pretty good. Like, I'm excited to watch the little basketball game tonight. Like, I'm gonna kick my feet up, get a cool drink, and I'm gonna restore my soul. I'm gonna rest, and it's gonna be about me. And then I think about this idea of Jesus increasing and me decreasing in my marriage. And I reflect upon my wife for a moment, who has been with toddlers all day long, who throw temper tantrums unexpectedly. She's been changing diapers. She's been doing laundry for the kids. She's been making a meal. She's been cleaning the house. She's been doing all these things. And I go, maybe it's time for her to get a break. Maybe she should kick her feet up and I should be helping with the kids. And then I have this battle where after the kids go down, it's like, oh, finally it's time. I've earned it now. Like, I've put the kids to bed. I've taken care of them. I'm gonna kick my feet up now. And oftentimes I have this battle where I look over and I go, there's still dishes around the kitchen sink. I don't know about you, but man, sometimes I just think maybe they'll just magically get cleaned. But Jesus increasing in your marriage means taking up things that you're not always gonna wanna do. And I have the greatest struggle with that day in and day out. But then I remember the role that Christ has given me as a husband. It's to sacrifice and give up my life as Jesus did for the church, and it's to serve my wife. And so for Christ in my marriage to increase, it means to me to get over myself and not to think that I deserve some couch time, deserve some time to rest, but it's to me to get off my behind and say, it's time to do the dishes. It's time for my wife to get a break. It's time for my kids to be loved on and cared on and just empower my love into them. I don't know about you, but I also think of my finances. Many of you were blessed this year. Some were not, and there was a difficult year financially. But some of you were able to keep your job during COVID. And not only keep your job, you ended up getting a stimulus check. And I don't know about you, but I got my stimulus check and I'm thinking, what can I spend on myself, man? This is gonna be great. Like, not only one stimulus check, but a second stimulus check. And then I'm reminded, as I read through the Gospel of John, I go, Jesus, may you increase in my finances. And may I decrease. Would you help me be generous with the gifts that you've given me, especially unexpected stimulus checks? I don't deserve those at all, but Father, would you help me be generous, to look beyond myself and to see some of these things? But then I also have time throughout my day. I go, there's some times where I have time on the weekends or in the evenings or the early mornings. And God, how do I have you increase in my time? And a group of people this Friday did a fantastic job of saying, Jesus, would you increase in my time so that I may decrease? And they served a group of refugees for 4 or 5 hours where they moved into a 3rd-story apartment, carrying couches and beds and groceries and all these things up there as a new family just this Tuesday night who's been in Africa their entire lives. They don't speak English, and they've stocked their apartment with these things to take time off work, to be able to sacrifice time from their family to say, instead of me kicking my feet up, God, how can you increase in the way that I use my time? And how can I decrease? Lord, may you be glorified in the use of my time. And so we may think of these things. Another area for you might be baptism. There was a member actually in our earlier in our church where they were here a couple years ago where they decided, man, it was time for me to give my life to Jesus and be baptized. And the day he was baptized, he invited a friend of his to this church for the very first time. They ended up hearing the gospel message and they grew in their marriage and they grew in their faith, became saved, invited other people to the church who invited other people. And the message of his testimony of Jesus increasing his life and him decreasing is still giving life to NorthPoint Church in our city here and now today. So maybe that's the next step for you. Maybe it's baptism, to say, I want to become a public follower of Jesus that he may increase and I may decrease. We might think of these things and go, well, gosh, this is like a long list of stuff. Like I gotta make sure I embrace a humble belief and pursue a humble attitude and live a humble life. And maybe I just gotta try really hard. Like, this is the week I'm gonna try to be a lot more humble. Like, I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna grind. I'm gonna wake up and be more humble. But if you ever tried a diet before, that's not the way it works. Like, you don't just try to have a healthy diet. Because especially if you work at a place like this, when you're walking by and you're seeing cookies and donuts and all that stuff every day, you're like, I'm gonna try today to walk past them. Oh, they smell good, but I'm only gonna smell them. Then you walk by again, you're like, oh, you know what? I'm just gonna take a corner of it. Like, you try really hard not to take the whole thing, and then it's not like you're taking one, you're taking 2 or 3, and all of a sudden, your diet's out the window. Like, trying to have a good diet doesn't work. You have to train yourself to have a good diet. You put healthy routines in your life. You put healthy things in your pantry so you don't eat junk food. But in addition to that, you begin a healthy workout routine. You train your body to be more healthy. In addition to that, man, you think of a 4-minute miler, somebody who's a dedicated track athlete, and it's not just on the day of the track meet, they go, today I'm gonna break 4 minutes in the mile. I'm gonna try the hardest I've ever tried today, and I'm gonna break 4 minutes in the mile. They don't break 4 minutes in the mile because they try hard. It's the training that's led up to that that's enabled them to do that. And we see the same thing of the advice that Paul gives Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Train yourself in godliness. He doesn't say, hey, Timothy, clean up your act, try harder, be a better leader, try really, really hard. No, train yourself in godliness. And how we do that is just like an athlete does. The things that are coming into our lives. We feed our souls with the gospel of grace and the cross of Jesus Christ. And as we feed ourselves with that, then we begin to become more humble. Because we see that we're not just inspired by John the Baptist to live out some of these principles. We're not just inspired by Moses or great preachers or people before us. We're not just encouraged by their stories. We're actually encouraged by Jesus Christ living this out himself. You know who embraced the humble belief? Jesus, by leaving heaven and coming to earth and having no room in an inn. And his humble belief was this: the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but he came to serve. And as he embraced that humble belief, he took up his life and he lived to serve people. But not only in his life did he do that, but in his death he did that. And I look at that and I go, man, if that was me, like there's no way would there be no room in the inn. Like if I was the King of Kings, just gonna be real honest with you, if I was the King of Kings, I'm coming down from heaven to earth, I would certainly not be born in a place without any room in the inn. I'd be born in a palace. I'd have those people who wave those little palm branches above my head when it's hot outside. I've had the people like drop the grapes in your mouth, and I have a sweet hot tub and pool and all that stuff, right? Like that's what I would want. I don't know about you. Maybe you're more humble than me, but like that's what I'm the King of Kings. Like that's what I would do. But Jesus embraced a humble belief that it wasn't about him. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And the church isn't built upon more and better and bigger leaders. It's built upon people who serve, who embrace a humble belief that there's nothing too great or too small for them to be able to do and submit for the kingdom of God. And it wasn't just a humble belief that he encountered, it was to pursue a humble attitude. And when we look to Jesus in the garden, the humble attitude that he assumed was this: Father, I don't want to go to the cross, but your will be done, not mine. As he embraced that humble belief, we read in John 3:16, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son to us. And what that means for you and I is this, is that Jesus was humble not only in his life, but in his death. As he was nailed to a cross and his feet were nailed down, he hung there and died a humiliating death. And above Jesus' head on the cross was this sign that says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And what that was to be able to describe who that person was on the cross and the accusation against them. He was said to be the King of the Jews, but we know that wasn't the crime that Jesus died for. Really up on that sign, it says, Jay Quick, lustful, prideful, boastful, judgmental, deceitful, and the list goes on and on and on. And it's not just my name up there, not just my sins above Jesus' head, it's yours as well. Jesus embraced a humble belief, pursued a humble attitude, and lived a humble life and death and died on a cross so that you may have life and have life to the fullest. So we're not just encouraged by John the Baptist and learn a few leadership principles from him. Jesus not only modeled this, but he lived this out so that he would save us. And so as we desire to say, Jesus, would you increase in my life? Would you increase in my marriage? Would you increase in my finances? Would you increase in my parenting? Would you increase in my job and my relationship and all the areas of my life? Would you increase? We fix our eyes on the one who gave up it all so that we might have life. It's not only his model, but it's him saving us that we have life and have life to the fullest. So would we be a church, NorthPoint Church, that says, Jesus, would you increase in our lives? Not about us, it's about you. Would you increase and may we decrease? Would you pray with me?